Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending and viewing this session today. I'm Matt Cropp, the co-executive director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, and this session is intended to be something of an overview of employee ownership, both the kind of why, the types of structures that can be used to do it, and then also a discussion of what are the particular nuances and additional things that have come up around the kind of the COVID era in terms of thinking about employee ownership in a variety of ways. So I'm really happy to be here with David Hammer of the ICA Group and Susan Halevi, who specializes in who's an attorney who specializes in ESOPs, co-ops, trusts, all of these different kind of structures that we'll be talking about today. So I'll start the presentation off, kind of giving that overview. I'll pass it to Susan, who will talk about the some of the specific structures, and then we'll get into more of this broad conversation. So I will start my screen share now for the slides. So let's see here, share, and pop that up, present. I should probably start at the beginning rather than the end here. All right. So I already mentioned the our roadmap for today. So this is kind of an example of a moment in time. Harpoon Brewery is a fairly well-known ESOP company in our region, and their story of coming into being as an employee-owned company and bringing employee ownership to their company was a somewhat long one. Number of us kind of had conversations with their leadership over the years, and they considered it and thought about various exit options. And ultimately, one of their co-founders decided they wanted to exit before the other, and they decided an employee stock ownership plan was the way to go. So the way I heard the story of them announcing to the employees was they put out the word and said, all right, let's everyone come down. We're going to have an all-staff meeting, and rumors started swirling. What was this? Was there a new owner of the company? And so they get up, they bring everyone into their tap room, and the CEO says this quote: "Stand up and turn to the person next to you and shake their hand, because you guys are now the owners." And that was the beginning of their journey as a company into this this kind of world of broad-based employee ownership. So when I say broad-based employee ownership, from the Vermont Employee Ownership Center's perspective, we define it kind of as, there's a lot of different ways you can approach having employees have some ownership in the company. So what we'll be talking about today is this kind of idea of broad-based, where a broad cross-section of the employees, including employees who are not managers, are co-owners of the company. They can own all of it. They can own a piece of it. It can be direct ownership, where they own a share, and they've put skin in the game in that way, sort of from their own bank account, or it can be indirectly through a trust. And there's different approaches to that, where it could be retirement plan like an ESOP, or it could be a perpetual trust, or a purpose trust that's owning a portion of the company. But the general expectation is that new full-time hires will have the opportunity to become co-owners. So it's not just a few kind of key employees or a few managers, but it's everyone in the company has the opportunity to sort of have a share in the wealth that they're helping to build as co-owners. So in this question of why employee ownership, what's the purpose, right? And the motivation for doing it. There's a number of them, but there's a few kind of core concepts here. So one is the idea of it just being a good exit strategy for founders that benefit the employees, right? So with this, a founder or owner can potentially realize, fair market value, and certainly some potential tax benefits that can also make it more attractive. They also can have some, more control potentially over the timing of their exit. A lot of folks, ideally should be thinking about exiting, 5-10 years at least beforehand, and oftentimes business owners only half tongue-in-cheek will talk about, you should start thinking about your exit, when you found the company, right? But it's something that can be often done gradually, or it can be done in a way that you can have some predictability in how much you want to be involved as you exit. So there's the kind of concept, and this is something that, especially the ESOP model, is this shared capitalism idea of bringing the employees in, so they're each year sharing in the equity and that's being built and the value of the company, and so that what both if they leave and that when they retire, they, in addition to what they've made, they also kind of have had a direct stake in the performance and the trajectory of the company and are rewarded for that. So there's this real alignment of incentives and sharing the kind of the wealth that's created by the firm. And then there's the kind of socially responsible business and triple bottom line economic democracy sort of motivations and approach, where we'll talk a little bit about the worker co-op model that is really about building. There's a lot of motivation in there around building workplaces that have high participation, where people kind of can find deep meaning in work as well as sharing wealth. And modeling different forms of power than the traditional for-profit firm usually does in terms of work life, and the idea of these employee-owned firms potentially being even multi-generational. You can look at examples like Mondragon in Spain, and the region Emilia-Romagna region of Italy as kind of mature multi-generational projects along these lines. So in terms of benefits, there's a number that exist both at the company level, at the individual level, and at the societal level, which is why there's a good amount of energy being put by some folks into trying to make sure it's more widely known as an option. So there's a lot of research that's been done, especially out of Rutgers University, around just kind of the performance of employee-owned companies, how different sorts of practices influence that. But there's a pretty good body of evidence at this point that, and you can see it sort of intuitively, the logic to it, of broad-based employee ownership increasing productivity and profits. So if everyone who's working in a company has the understanding that if the company does better, they will do better along with it in a fairly predictable, clear way that they have line of sight to, they're gonna work harder. They're gonna perhaps engage in some mutual self-monitoring in terms of how people are working, and they're gonna see the company perhaps as a vehicle through which their sort of creative ideas can be implemented, and everyone can benefit from that, versus it being something where maybe they have a dream that could be someday they'll start their own business and keep that motivation and energy for that project rather than helping build a company that they co-own. From a generally social and societal level, they tend to do fewer layoffs in recessions. And so looking at a few, we'll see how the COVID-19 sort of statistics stack up. But anecdotally, I've certainly had some conversations with employee-owned companies in Vermont about both the hard conversations they've been having with their workforces and the kind of creativity they're engaged in to sort of keep their community of work together and avoid layoffs if they don't need to. Temporary. I was talking to a company yesterday, in fact, that was all the owners agreed to take a temporary pay cut until the end of August, which they'll reassess. But that sort of the trust and mutuality amongst those folks was what allowed them to all agree to do that for each other. And ESOP companies are really a wealth builder. So the average worker who works in one of these companies, a lot of studies show that they often have multiples of the retirement savings of their peers, because in terms of where wealth is in our economy and society, companies are really one of those big places, and creating a consistent opportunity for people to build wealth through their work has a powerful effect. And of course, folks who have more economic security are gonna, that lessens the strain on the sort of support mechanisms in our economy, and also just makes folks more resilient and less prone to kind of the sorts of crisis damage that they can receive when things take a downturn. And this is true across generations. There's a great study recently looking at young workers and how working for an ESOP company really sort of powerfully increases their wealth and also their job tenure. And that kind of question of, okay, if you own the company, what, and you have a deeper commitment to it, this the turnover is often going to be lower. So this is just kind of a study of from home care, comparing the general home care industry to home care co-ops, where turnover in home care co-ops is less than half of the general home care industry. And so the largest worker cooperative in the U.S. In terms of number of employees is Cooperative Home Care Associates in New York City, and this is home care's that oftentimes been understood as in care labor in general, an undervalued form of labor in our society. Oftentimes, something where people are often isolated and not kind of part of a large. Oftentimes, it's maybe working for the single person, not part of a larger community of practice. And so, what Cooperative Home Care Associates has achieved is pretty impressive in terms of both building a strong community of practitioners who are receiving better wages and building wealth within the context of their company, and building their professional skills together. So, they have, I think, over at this point 2,500 workers in that company. So, and this kind of question of if this is your company, you understand it as that it can shift how people view their jobs, right? Versus something where people are going to kind of bounce between a few things. The idea that you've got a future here that your work is contributing to and the performance of, and you can see over a longer term, means that a job that someone might have viewed more as like a stepping stone somewhere else, they're more likely to stay and view that as a real career. And the sort of trust and skills and human capital that can build in firms is definitely a contributor to how employee-owned companies tend to be stronger performers and more productive as a result of that deep buy-in on the part of their workforce. And here's a quote from just our motivation was to make the future about equality and enhancement of the company culture and behavior, right? So this ownership as a foundation for building a strong company culture involved that is rooted in trust and kind of a shared vision for where they're trying to go and what kind of work lives they're trying to build together. Really speaks to, I think, the power of employee ownership to drive company performance. And as I mentioned before, right, this kind of idea of retirement security and the ability of an ESOP in particular, because it is a retirement plan that folks can make pre-tax contributions to really sort of build that economic security and the long-term security of its employees. There's some great stories of cashiers at Publix and other sorts of ESOP, traditionally low-wage companies retiring with $1 million+ after 30 years of working kind of in the front line of the grocery store, because they're given this, they have this opportunity through their workforce or the workplace that otherwise would never have been on the table, and that sort of security wouldn't have been imaginable. And so Web Industries is another fairly well-known and highly regarded ESOP company in kind of the in the employee ownership world, that's gone beyond sort of its original founding company and has acquired a number of and brought a number of additional companies under its umbrella, including CADCUT here in Vermont. And so this idea of thinking about founder legacy, right? You've created a business, or you've put a lot of energy into growing a business, and what's the next step when it's time for the founder to step out, right? This idea of bringing all of the folks who worked with you to help bring the company to that point into ownership and making it having an equitable exit that you're compensated fairly for, but also puts the company on the path to to both preserving the legacy and building into something perhaps even stronger as this next step can be, it can be a powerful experience for many founders. And so employee ownership can happen at different points in the company life cycle. So there's, a lot of the work that we do at the VEOC is around, talking to business owners or more on that late stage kind of thinking about retirement thing. But there's definitely opportunities to use employee ownership and to sort of implement it early on or plan for it early on, to sort of get the ducks in a row. So one example of an ESOP company that's fairly well known in Vermont that very early in their life started their ESOP journey is Gardner Supply Company. Their founder, from the beginning had the sort of vision of wanting to have that alignment and the culture of ownership. And so they set up I think they were maybe 5 years old when they set up an ESOP plan. And in the beginning, just started adding a little bit of money in years when they had extra, when they were particularly profitable, and slowly building up their employee ownership that way. There's also, worker cooperatives can oftentimes start from the beginning as employee owned. So there's, and there's definitely these benefits of saying, all right, so, people who are coming in, building that culture from the ground up of ownership can be a powerful thing for folks who are thinking, who are in the entrepreneurial stage or thinking about, what direction do you want to go, and how do you want to engage those early employees. But as I mentioned, the succession strategy is probably where we see employee ownership happen by far the most often, right? So, it's selling to the employees. First of all, it's an internal sale, right? It creates a market for the founder owner shares. And the legacy consideration I mentioned, we have this opportunity to keep the company going, keep this continuity of culture, and really even in many cases where a company has a strong identification with the founder, the question of, okay, when it's transition, how do you maintain that sort of sense of reputation and culture, and the sort of the narrative of I'm passing this on to the employees who've been working with me this whole time can be a useful and effective one for that sort of transition of almost charismatic authority. The owner can stay involved or not. So we see plenty of situations where an owner will sell but also be on the buy side, both in terms of the bigger companies where oftentimes that'll allow for a more gradual leadership transition. So the owner might stay on as the CEO and become sort of a co-owner along with everyone else through the employee ownership plan. Or sometimes it can be more of a gradual transition out where the owner is going to do the sort of thing where they start they start off mentoring the successor manager, and they might work part-time for a while and kind of gradually fade out. But that involvement can be really sort of, there's a whole spectrum and can be tailored to the needs and desires of the owner. There's tax savings, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but particularly the ability to defer and sometimes even as part of estate planning, eliminate capital gains taxes through what's called the 1042 rollover. And again, lining the sort of interests of owners and employees, and this is particularly for things where you have partial employee ownership, like the Harpoon example we gave before, where you can sort of have a stepped approach where you sort of bring in a minority ownership stake through say an ESOP. The employees start doing open book management. You start building that ownership culture and helping to drive the performance of the business overall. And then when the owner is ready to exit the rest of their stake, they have a ready buyer that's already has experience and sort of an identity around this, which can be, again, a powerful thing. So with that, I'll pass the baton to Susan to talk through, as we've gone over the general ideas around employee ownership, to talk through some of the specific ways that we can actually make employee ownership happen in companies. So Susan.
Hey, thanks, Matt. That was great. Terrific overview, really sums it all up. So I'm going to take a look, but only a summary look, at the different ways of creating employee ownership from a legal and business structural point of view. And all of these, there's a lot of detail here, but it's good to start with a broad overview because it takes a few times through. It's a new language, it's a new way of thinking. And so the purpose today is to just do that first pass through, or a quick review for those of you who are already familiar. And Matt's got the deck, so I'm just going to say slide.
Boop.
Thank you. So ESOPs, we talk about ESOPs a lot because they're a very popular form of employee ownership, in part because there's substantial tax savings, tax benefits that can come along with ESOPs. And they are supported by federal legislation and structured by federal legislation. They're also regulated by federal legislation, both as an employee benefit plan and also under the tax code. So there's advantages and disadvantages, but ESOPs are very well known, and there's a lot of them across the country, about 320 in New England as of 4 years ago. And worker co-ops are also very popular. As you can see, there aren't as many worker co-ops as ESOPs, but worker co-ops are a kind of a world and a force unto themselves. They have a unique culture, very, very supportive of democratic workplace, typically. And so there's a kind of cultural alignment that often comes with being a worker co-op. And there's some that have been around for a very long time. And here in New England, we have the support of the Cooperative Fund of New England, which is a CDFI, a community development financial institution, which for decades has supported cooperatives and worker cooperatives right here in New England as a source of financing and social capital. So investors, socially responsible investors, would put money into the cooperative fund and they make loans. And there's also the National Cooperative Bank. So there are unique opportunities for co-ops as well because of that alignment. And we're also going to take a look at some hybrid models, of which there are several, but just looking at those three baskets there as a roadmap for where we're headed in the next slide. And slide again. So as I mentioned, ESOPs are subject to ERISA and code. ERISA is the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And before you feel overwhelmed by that, it's similar to a 401k. 401ks are also subject to federal regulation. And once the company gets accustomed to working within that framework, it works great, and the employees and the company get the benefits of those plans. An ESOP, unlike a 401k, must invest primarily in company stock. That's what it's for. And the stock is typically, it can be either purchased with borrowed money or non-leveraged, like Matt was talking about, when the company makes contributions to the ESOP of stock or cash over time, it can build that ESOP up over a long period of time. If it's a transition, a succession by the owners or founders, it's typically either the company's going to borrow money to finance it, or the owners will finance it with taking back a seller note. So, but either way, the money, if you say, where does the money come from? It comes from the future cash flow of the company. So the future cash flow of the company is used to cash out the owners. And when that is done, when that financing is accomplished, then the owner is the ESOP trust, the ESOP trustee, which holds the stock in trust for the benefit of the employees. Slide. So what companies, if someone says, oh, well, is my company a good ESOP candidate? Should I be thinking about an ESOP? And there are a few things you can look at as indicators. Stable cash flow with slow to medium growth. Why? Because very often the acquisition is financed out of cash flow, so you want to know that there's going to be cash flow. If cash flow is very up and down over the recent 5, 7 years, and kind of looks like it's going to be like that in the future. It might be hard to pay back that acquisition debt. Slow to medium growth. Well, if the company needs a lot of cash for R&D or things like that, if it's in a fast growth mode, then it may not have cash available to pay off the acquisition financing. So that's what those things are relevant to. Debt capacity may be relevant if you want to get bank financing for the acquisition. And successor management is super important. Very often, very typically, companies that have founders still present and actively engaged really were built by those founders and may be a reflection of the founders in many important ways. So then the question comes, the day comes, well, what happens next? And so it's a good idea to start planning for that in advance, and to have to be cultivating successor managers within the company. And of course, that can also be a work in progress as a company makes the transition to employee ownership. But it's one way or another, it's really important that there be good successor management, because that's what's going to help guide the company and the workers through the transition and generating the future profits. The owners, because it's financed, this isn't like a third-party buyer coming in and they get the financing and hand over a lot of cash to the owners who then leave. This is for a situation where the owners are okay getting paid out over time, and in some cases that's fine because they don't really want to go out the door right now, but want to participate in the transition. If a company has a strategic buyer offering a large premium, that may prove to be irresistible. But sometimes it is quite resistible. I talked to founders last year who were in an engineering design company, and they have a great company, and they hired engineers who lost their jobs when other companies were bought out. And they didn't want that to happen to their company. So they got offers all the time and just threw them away. And so for them, an ESOP was a really, really interesting alternative. The number one thing, I think NCO has done a poll on what is one of the single most important drivers of the decision from the founder's point of view, from the owner's point of view, to consider employee ownership. It's legacy. The founders are invested in the company. Literally, they've invested their lives, their fortunes, and very often, especially the ones who are interested in employee ownership, they want to know that that's going to continue in a meaningful way, and to reward the people who've worked alongside them to build the company. Slide, please. So we've talked about this, there it is. There's some more of it. There it is. There it goes. Because it's loading. Yeah, there it goes. I've given you the narrative. Here's a visual. Where does the money come from? The company gets the money from the bank, or the seller takes a note from the company, and the company then loans the money to the ESOP, and the ESOP buys the money from the sellers and holds those shares in trust. And then as that financing is paid down, the shares are released into the accounts of the employees within the trust. So just like you have a 401k account as a participant, as an ESOP participant, you'll have an ESOP account, and the shares will be distributed to the employees over time, and they're typically vesting periods and so forth. But that's then when the when the employee retires or leaves the company, or if they were to die, there are distributions from those accounts. So that's the sort of high level visual flow of how it works. Slide. Tax benefits, as we mentioned, can be really very motivating for ESOPs, a company to do an ESOP, especially an S corporation, because and this is unique to ESOPs, the ESOP trust, which owns the stock, is tax exempt. So with an S corporation, as you know, the income flows through to the owners, and then the owners pay the tax. Well, if your owner is tax exempt, they don't pay tax. So typically with an S corporation, you've got the company distributing out, making a tax distribution so that the owners can pay the taxes because the income's attributed to them. Well, if the owner's not paying taxes because they're tax exempt, then that money that would otherwise be used for tax distribution stays in the company. So the company has a significant amount of cash that it's now retaining instead of paying to the government. And so it's in proportion to ESOP ownership. So if you've got 100% ESOP owned S corporation, it is 100% income tax free from at the federal level and for many states. And that's a tremendous incentive. That also helps finance that acquisition debt and administrative expenses. And when it works, it works really well. If you have a C corporation, there are also tax benefits. The sellers can defer their capital gains for a period of time, or as Matt mentioned, with estate planning, forever. If the proceeds stay in the estate, they're not taxed when the estate is distributed after death. So, and you can have that deferral of capital gains, and there's some interesting financial vehicles to help support that. And for both S corporations and C corporations, that repayment of the ESOP loan that I mentioned are deductible as expenses. So you're repaying that loan with tax-free dollars. Each of these can get quite technical, but it's nice to just kind of, with a broad brush, this, and this. These are the reasons why people get interested in ESOPs from a tax point of view. Slide, please. So seller, founder wants to know, well, how much will I get if I go this route? And the ESOP trustee can pay fair market value as determined by an independent appraiser, but not more. So that strategic buyer premium isn't going to happen. It's part of the federal regulations that the trustee not pay more than fair market value, but you get fair market value. And the transaction usually starts with a transaction analysis or that you do yourself. The founder or founders would hire, and we do this for folks. And so you get an idea. It's usually a multiple of EBITDA. You get an idea, a range of where the trustee is going to come out. And then the trustee, so to make sure that it is a fair deal, hires their own appraiser and goes through that process. And then there's a negotiation, and you arrive at a price within that range of fair market value. Slide, please. Worker cooperatives. We mentioned that different model and to a certain extent a different culture, although it is possible to have a democratic ESOP, and there are some where it's an ESOP structure but has the democratic ownership features that are common to worker co-ops. But when we think of worker co-ops, that's what comes to mind first and foremost, is worker democracy. Slide, please. A worker cooperative is owned and controlled by the employees. So they are the direct owners, not through a trust, but the employees directly. There are typically, there's a period of time before you become an owner. There's a process by which you become an owner. But when you're through that process, you're a full owner. And you have voting rights. Owners control companies by voting their shares or ownership interests. And with a worker co-op, it's one person, one vote. So it's very different from a business corporation where the amount of voting power that you have as a stockholder depends on how many shares of stock you have. And in a worker cooperative, you're one person, you have one vote. Slide, please. Oh, and yeah, and those logos there, Equal Exchange, of course, is a very, very well-known New England cooperative. And there's a process for converting to a co-op. Now, as Matt mentioned, some companies right from the start, they're going to say, this is who we are. This is who we want to be. This is what we want to be. I want to start a co-op. And so we certainly see that. And then we see companies that become co-ops after they get established, or it can be used as an exit strategy or succession planning, because remember that tax deferral, it's called 1042. That applies if you sell to a worker cooperative as well, not only to ESOPs. In any event, you go through a process of analyzing the transaction, detailing the structure, and very important with cooperatives, going through a process of employee education. Because in a cooperative, from day one, once that transaction closes, the employees who are eligible to be owners own it. So they're typically very involved also in the process of becoming a co-op. Slide, please. So your membership share can only be owned by the employee. You can't sell it to anyone else. The monetary value of it doesn't change. So that's very different from a business corporation or an ESOP, where what you own changes in value over time. With a worker co-op, it doesn't, and your benefit comes from the money that flows through the co-op on an ongoing basis. So it's not like you hold that share and it appreciates in value and then you cash it out when you leave. It's by virtue of being an employee, you get a distribution, your dividend, your co-op dividend, and that is the way that you obtain ownership value, your ownership value. It's not transferable, and your ownership is redeemed when the member leaves. That way, the ownership of the company stays within the circle of the employees. Slide, please. And we mentioned the 1042, which is the capital gains deferral for founders who sell to worker co-ops. And the benefit to the members, a co-op tax benefit to the members, is that when the company's net income is distributed to the members, it's not double taxed. So it's not money that the company is paying tax on and then the members are paying tax on. There's only one level of tax. So again, that makes, there's more money available to the company and the workers as a result. Sales price, how much do we get if we're an owner of a business and we want to do a co-op conversion? Again, the sales price is negotiated you take a look at what a financial buyer would pay, but there's no requirement, and there's no, it's not regulated in the same way that the ESOP purchase price is. The selling owners can remain as worker owners if they like, so you have that same attribute of flexibility. And I mentioned the Cooperative Fund of New England. There are other CDFIs and social purpose investors that provide folks interested in a co-op with some interesting investment and finance opportunities. Slide, please. There's also other flexible structures that you can consider. And these are interesting conversations that you can have as you explore what the possibilities are. Slide, please. For example, you may have heard of employee ownership trusts. Together with, we're assisting ICA, we worked on designing an employee ownership trust last year. And this is a trust without beneficiaries. The purpose of the trust is to own the company. And it's especially interesting to companies that are very mission driven and that want to protect that mission. You may have heard of B corporations, benefit corporations, which is another way of protecting a mission driven company. And the employee ownership trust is a perpetual purpose trust that seeks to lock in the mission of the company by not having any owners. The trust owns the company and serves the mission. And it's a very interesting structure. You notice that I said the trust owns the company. Well, that means that the employees don't own the company, and it doesn't. The trust doesn't have any beneficiaries. That means the employees aren't the beneficiaries. So and that's true. So in what sense is it employee ownership? And the way it has ownership-like aspects is that the trusts, when used for this purpose, are designed to benefit the employees in terms of the practices of the company and the employment practices and benefits and the orientation of the company. So it's an interesting alternative way of locking in mission and purpose. S corporation cooperative partnership. You can do a co-op using a number of different legal structures. There in Massachusetts, there is a cooperative statute, so you can be organized as a co-op, but you could also be organized as an S corporation, regular S corporation, but your operating agreement is structured along co-op principles, because an LLC. No, I'm sorry, that's an LLC. You could do an LLC, or you could do an S corporation. With the S corporation, the money's flowing through to the shareholders, and you can structure that in a cooperative manner. We don't have an LLC here, but I've added that concept in there as well because of the flexibility of the LLC structure. You can design a cooperative style LLC. Multi-stakeholder cooperatives, very, very interesting. Again, because of the flexibility of design, you can have co-op members who are employees, and also co-op members who are customers, and also co-op members who are community stakeholders. The employee stock purchase plan, that's a really interesting one. That's a vehicle for employees to buy stock in the company themselves, and you can do a payroll deduction plan. It is very often there are a lot of ESPPs in the United States. Almost all of them are in public companies because there's already a market for the shares. However, there are some notable private ESPPs, and in the companies where it works, they love it. And there's a company in Pennsylvania that is 60% employee owned, and it was done over 20 years' time with an ESPP. There's profit sharing plans, and there's stock compensation. All of these count as employee ownership. And so as you can see, there's a lot of different ways to go.
All right, so we'll jump into this momentarily, but I did want to, I noticed there were a few questions, so wanted to check and see about, in particular, the question around LLCs. So, in particular, could you address issues related to the current form of the company being an LLC before, as you want to convert to employee ownership? And perhaps that's, particularly, I think in the ESOP model, because some of those benefits are related to being an S Corp or a C Corp or something like that as a starting point.
So an LLC that's thinking about an ESOP could consider a conversion. ESOPs are only available to corporations. You'd have to look at the particular situation, and I'd be happy to have a longer conversation about it and follow up afterwards.
Great. All right. So then, yeah, let's shift over to our conversation, kind of about what is the COVID-19 era and some of the particularities of this current moment that we're in. What are the implications of that for folks thinking about a shift to employee ownership? So David, do you want to introduce yourself and share some of your kind of initial thoughts on this, and we'll get into a little dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here and to hear the great information that both you, Matt, and Susan shared. I think what we wanted to do here really was to kind of just sort of set the stage a little bit for like what does COVID-19, what does the economic impact of COVID-19 have on these decision making, these decisions and people's thinking about it, and how are things different, and just to sort of talk a little bit about that in a general sense, but then to make sure that we're sort of opening up for questions from the participants, to make sure we're sort of answering the questions that you've specifically got. So that the key things I think that we wanted to sort of, as we've been sort of working and talking to companies in this space, the key thing is that in a lot of firms, what is happening is uncertainty, and uncertainty makes decisions more challenging. It doesn't make them sort of right or wrong, but it makes them more challenging. And so when thinking about issues around, like, there's high unemployment, and think about and there's financial uncertainty, that these are all factors that really do drive really do impact how a business is going to be making a decision on on this. So specifically, some of the things we've been thinking about is there's a big push for government funding and support for small businesses and medium-sized businesses, and large businesses a little bit different. But most of that is based upon debt. And so if you've got an owner who is in their late 60s, early 70s, and looking at retirement, and all of a sudden they say, and their business is like really critical part of their job or their retirement plan, the idea that you would sort of take on additional debt to right that ship for 5, 10, how long is the period that you have to figure out to get that, to pay off that debt and to deal with it is a real big impact in terms of how a business is thinking about this. And so one of the things that we've looked at, there is that, in fact, sometimes an employee ownership transition creates an opportunity where a selling owner might say, I'm not interested in taking on new debt to sort of stabilize this business because that makes me nervous, but I will work with this new group of employees who might be willing to take on debt to write this business because they're going to be here for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? They're going to be here for a long time. And it's really about sharing some of that burden. The other kind of things that we've sort of have come up that I think are, really change things is, and we can talk about this if folks have questions around it, is the uncertainty around valuation. Now, some businesses, the COVID-19 is not going to, has not impacted their, their revenue or their, things in a significant way. We talked recently to a food manufacturing company, and lo and behold, they are, their problem is pulling people in, getting people to come to work, keeping people, but they have an enormous demand, right? They sell a product through grocery stores, and lo and behold, grocery store sales are going up, right? Not down. And so there's, far more demand for their product. And so in that situation, there's not uncertainty around the valuation. However, in a lot of businesses, if you look at, as Susan laid out, that, this idea of valuation, it's really on a financial piece, it's really about using future cash flows to determine, what the debt capacity of the business is, or what the sort of free cash flow of business is. And when, revenues go way down, or, if you're dealing on real estate costs, or, all of these things can have a big, impact. And so I think, the short answer on sort of how to deal around thinking about the valuation challenge is that it really does require kind of a different view and a different sometimes a different timeline on this. And I think this is a place where ESOPs and versus other forms of ownership, there's maybe kind of a division there, or a break, or a split there, in that in the case of an ESOP, it's not the selling owner who's saying, this is what I think the price should be, and sort of setting that. It's a trustee who is, obviously they have to agree to the price, but it's a trustee who's setting that, price. And that's really going to be based upon the existing most recent financials. And there's going to have, there's going to be some constraints about saying, well, but we know that things are going to come back in 6 months' time or 3 months' time, or we're confident that things are going to come back in 3 months' time. You have to really look at, those things. It's really tricky. It's really difficult. So for businesses that have been, their revenue's been impacted by COVID, or by, the economic crisis we're having right now, valuation is a complicated thing. There's just lots of factors that need to think into it. And so there's a lot of, I think one of the things that's come up is that people have really raised issues of thinking about the role of seller financing, the role of earnouts, and royalty financing, and basically, having kind of performance-based payments for businesses. We work with there's a roundtable of exit planning groups, and I'd say that we spend some time talking to, and I'd say in the last 3 months, the royalty financing, earnouts, those words have been said more than they've been said in the 2 years prior to it. It just becomes a real factor that people are thinking about, of saying we might want to do the transition now, but the price that based upon what we see today isn't high enough. We need to think about the future. That creates uncertainty. So let's continue to think about sort of payments into the future. The other piece that for us at ICA that we've sort of seen is that because so many people are unemployed, because the factors in this crisis are so widespread, and because there's so much like sort of uncertainty in the world right now, that a lot of people are actually spending a lot of time thinking about how they engage effectively with their employees. Like, how do they take care of their employees? How do they, they like thinking about, lots of small businesses, not every small business, but most small businesses, or lots of small businesses, think about their employees as part of their family. And so I think a lot of people have looked at this and said, how do we, what are the things that we can do to maintain a relationship with our staff if they're on layoff or if they're on furlough? And actually, a lot of businesses have looked at employee ownership as an approach to this, and really looking and saying, if in fact we start talking to folks about employee ownership right now, this is a way to have a sort of a meaningful and interesting conversation with our staff in order to keep them together. So I think in a general sense, that's kind of what we've been sort of seeing in terms of the response, that more businesses are thinking about employee ownership or employee engagement in a sort of in a different way, and are looking for some responses. And that valuation is a big sort of red flag of something that needs to be addressed in this process, but that there's not sort of a single or simple answer to it, and that becomes a big issue. So.
One thing I'll throw in also related to the high unemployment dynamic is that one thing that we've seen is more kind of interest on the employee side. And I think part of that is that there's, especially for the types of conversions that require employee involvement, right? So the ESOP thing is something the trustee, it's kind of this technical thing, and then as we talked about at the beginning, that example of employees kind of being announced that, hey, you guys are owners, right? With the kind of worker co-op conversion requires much more employee engagement. And I think in that question of like, okay, what is going to motivate employees to sort of want to put the time and headspace into actually kind of participating in that process? I think the context is very different when you're looking at like 2-3% unemployment, where people are kind of it's regularly hopping between careers, in the sense that you can easily find another good job if this one job doesn't pan out, versus the idea of saying, okay, jobs are much more precious now, and so an employee ownership conversion would be a way of kind of securing these jobs for the future and making it structurally a better job. So we've seen more outreach from kind of interested employees who are interested in exploring this since the crisis started, in terms of volume, than we've probably seen in years. Because normally our context is very highly kind of owner driven, where they do the initial investigation and then they bring it to the employees. And I think we've definitely seen that dynamic shift a bit since March.
Yeah, I would say that, in a caution, employee ownership isn't going to save a company if the company, in the circumstances that it's in, if it looks like it isn't going to make it, employee ownership isn't going to change. That's not going to be. It can't change everything, but what it can change is the level of employee engagement, literally ownership, as Matt is suggesting. And it can also provide some tax benefits, as we've discussed. And in terms of, is now the time? The answer is it depends on the company. And for some, as Dave mentioned, for some companies, their valuation is going to be okay. Might even be better than it was last year. And for other companies, their valuation has taken a hit, but they still may be able to structure a transition negotiation where they can get the upside over time. Dave mentioned earnouts. So, and I think that at the beginning of the pandemic, a few months ago, the beginning of our awareness and experience of it, I should say, folks were kind of like deer in the headlights. because nobody knew anything about how this was going to unfold. And although we're still in the midst of a lot of uncertainty and turmoil to a certain, in many ways, the sense is that people are beginning to, I wouldn't say quite get their bearings, but at least get their footing. It's like you can walk on a deck of the boat that's rocking once you kind of get accustomed to it. And so even now, we're seeing that people are more willing to say, okay, I can maneuver this.
Yeah. One thing I would just add on that I think is interesting is, so at ICA, we play a role of helping facilitate the transition of companies from their current ownership to employee ownership, and we work with a mostly smaller companies, but companies sort of across the country and in different industries. And one of the things that's been interesting about this is that no one that we were working with prior to March has said, well, now I'm not going to do this. But every single one has said, this has impacted like the timeline or how we're thinking about it. Now, for some, it has sped up the timeline where people said, I'm shut down. I have time to focus on this. I'm going to put the energy in right now. Let's like, this is a way. I've got PPP, I got like a PPP loan. I can, do Zoom calls with my staff to pay them to, even though we're not really operating, to pay them to be part of this process. We've had people sort of say like, we want to move quicker. And we've had people say like, I'm going to hit pause and we don't know what this means. And we've had people who've said like, let's just keep on going what we were doing. So I think it's just a telling sign that like, this is not a, kind of it certainly changes how people think about things, but it's it hasn't been, for us at least, a real sort of a driver of like, oh, this stuff is shut down and it's no longer working, or everybody wants to do this. It's I think it's raised different, people are thinking about the world differently, and so maybe more open to some of these ideas. But like a lot of people are still thinking about this, and we're making some interesting progress, with folks. So I think that's something to, folks are considering it. This is certainly not a reason, COVID is not a reason not to sort of begin that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we are at the hour. So I think maybe to wrap up, just any if each of you have any kind of like final thoughts or advice to someone who's investigating this possibility right now, kind of like, maybe if there's a few things that you would just say are good things to do as next steps, or just things to consider as they're kind of starting down this path. So maybe Susan.
Yeah, talk to us. And I'm looking at all three of us. You have wonderful resources right here on this call with VEOC, which has been a leader, and ICA for so long, for decades in employee ownership in New England, and terrific leadership within those organizations right now at VEOC and ICA, and our firm is ready, willing, and able to help. We do feasibility analyses on the business side, and we have an affiliated law firm to help on the legal side. Happy to talk.
And David, final thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think for us, what we find is that the earlier a business owner starts thinking about this, the easier it is to do it. Just talked to a business just recently who said, well, 5 years ago we thought about doing an ESOP, but my partner said, no, that won't work because of this. And what the partner thought was wrong. Like, it actually totally could have worked because of this. I mean, the thought was like, the staff don't have the money to buy the company. That was the concern, right? And they sold to somebody else, and they have seller's remorse. They really regret who they sold it to. They're really sad about the legacy. They were talking to us about another business they have. the more that you can sort of have those conversations from an exploratory standpoint with folks, and there are lots of, both, Matt and Susan and myself on this call, but there are lots of organizations out there, the ESOP Association, the National Center for Employee Ownership. There are lots of groups out there who are sort of willing to have these conversations and to be a guide. And nobody's out there saying, this is what you have to do. It's about giving people the information to make the right decision for them. Employee ownership isn't right for everyone, but it's right for a lot more businesses than are employee owned. They just haven't gone through that exploration. So that would be my thing, just talk to folks.
Great. Well, thank you both for taking the time this morning to share your wisdom and insights into this and experience into, what's going on for folks. We've been recording this session, so I will be posting it in the next day or so on our YouTube channel for the Vermont Employee Ownership Center YouTube channel, and we'll kind of put it out in our newsletter as well for folks who might have caught part of it. Yeah, so we're all here as a resource. And the final thing I'll say is that this is the date that would have been the Vermont Employee Ownership Center conference pre-COVID. So we're kind of doing this today as a little bit as a kind of teaser and taste, but we will be doing a more full, day-long event that we're neck deep in planning right now on August 18th. So if this is something you're interested in getting, going into a deeper dive, that'll be a great opportunity to do so. So stopping the recording now.